Introduction to directives. Hello everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget we're going to talk about a cool feature of AngularJS called directives. Now, you've already worked a whole bunch with directives, even if you don't realize it. Directives are the things that let us extend the vocabulary of HTML to create our HTML templates. They make for nice, concise, readable HTML templates that are also easily testable and promote good separation of concerns in our code. We'll start this nugget off by talking about what are directives. Specifically, what are they? How do they work? What are the different ways that they can be formatted and used inside of your Angular application? And then we'll talk about how AngularJS itself implements those directives. We'll take a brief look at some of the directives that are built into AngularJS, a whole bunch of the ones we've used already, as well as some that we haven't. And also we'll talk about the compilation loop, how AngularJS binds or ties those directives inside of your HTML template back to the backend JavaScript code. Lastly, we'll take a look at our own custom directive. We'll build a custom directive from the ground up. It'll do something very simple, but you'll see how you can implement your own custom directives and take advantage of this great feature for your own web applications. All right, let's get started. So what are directives in AngularJS? Well, believe it or not, you've actually used directives quite a bit. Directives are the control statements inside of your DOM, inside of your HTML code, that tell AngularJS how that DOM element, how that HTML should look or behave. Take a look at these two examples here. In these examples, the two custom bits of AngularJS code are the directives. So ngModel and max are actually directives. They are code that tells AngularJS what to do, how to handle this input box. It directs AngularJS. And we've used a whole lot of these directives already. Everything from ng-app, ng-model, ng-controller. We've seen ng-repeat, min and max, all the form validation directives. All of these things are directives in AngularJS. You might be thinking, why call them directives at all? They've already got a name in HTML. They're called attributes. Why do we have to come up with a new word for them? Let's just call them custom attributes or Angular attributes. Well, that's because these custom attributes are not the only way in AngularJS to reference a directive. We can also use the class attribute to reference a new directive like this. And we can use HTML comments to reference directives with this syntax, directive colon, and then your directive name. Lastly, and maybe the coolest way, is that we can create custom HTML elements and inject our directives exactly like this, like they were built-in native HTML elements. All of these are valid syntax in AngularJS, but the folks over at Angular recommend that you stick to either the custom attribute or the custom HTML element version. And that's just because they're the easiest to read, they make the most sense, and they fit in with your HTML documentation properly. These other options are useful in case you need to play nicely with another web development framework, and this custom attribute or custom element syntax would otherwise interfere with that application. Remember, Angular wants to play nicely with all the different tools in your technology stack. Before we go any further, let's do a little bit of vocabulary work, the kind of stuff that I want to make sure that we all have a good, solid understanding of before we move forward in understanding directives and building custom directives. It's a very complex kind of topic, so let's make sure that we understand all the vocabulary involved. For starters, let's talk about basic HTML vocabulary. This stuff is no different than any other web development framework, any other thing that you might be doing on the web. These are HTML vocab words. They're important to know. So first, the DOM. The DOM is just your page. DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it's not anything different than your HTML page. It's simply a way of considering or looking at your HTML page as a collection of objects that relate to one another. So as opposed to a big brick of text with some markup embedded in it, that's what HTML is, right? The DOM thinks about your page as a series of elements that are all parent and children of one another. So elements are the Angular bracket statements that you see inside of an HTML page. Body, P, H1, whatever. These are called elements. They are the items inside of those Angular brackets. They're the main entity in your DOM. Parent and child refer to the relationship between those elements and their parents. So you might have an element, and then inside of that, another element. So in this example here, the parent element is this first one, the child element is the second one. In HTML, every parent can have many children, but each child only ever has one parent, its enclosing element. Attributes are the code inside of those Angular HTML elements. So if you think about over here, we've got type and class and ngModel and mask, etc., etc. Those are called attributes. They belong to an element, but they are the attributes of that element. And lastly, the value. The value is what exists in between the element statements. So the value is this data, this text right here. It's the text of your paragraph, it's the items of your unordered list. Whatever you've got inside of that element, that's the element's value. I also briefly want to cover two AngularJS specific vocab words, denormalized and normalized. Now, these are applied to directives, and they refer to the fact that directives in your HTML, in your DOM, look a little bit different than directives in your JavaScript code. The reason for that is HTML is case insensitive. It doesn't care whether a letter is uppercase or lowercase. It's all the same to HTML. JavaScript, on the other hand, is case sensitive. A capital letter is different than a lowercase letter as far as JavaScript is concerned. Now, as we'll talk about in a minute, your DOM is passed through the web browser interpreter, the web browser API, before being handed to AngularJS in order to be processed and have these directives hooked up. Because of that, Angular doesn't know what case the text will come back to it from the web browser. Uppercase, lowercase, mixed case, whatever, it's not reliable. So Angular has to go through a step it calls normalization, and that's where it turns your statement ng-model into ng-M-model. And all that's happening here is the dash tells it to turn the next character into an uppercase letter. You'll see in the JavaScript we reference directives in this way, whereas in our DOM we reference them that way. And this works not just for ng dash, but also ng colon and ng underscore. Now Angular recommends that you use the dash version. Colon and underscore have been deprecated, but they're still there. They still work for legacy purposes, and it's important to know that they all function the same way. Let's take a look at that real quick. On screen here, I've got an example of some different directives in action. ng app controller repeat, and they work and look exactly like you're used to until you look a little bit closer. You'll notice that ng controller has a colon instead of a dash. ng repeat has that underscore instead of the dash. And you might think that would break Angular since we're used to seeing the dash syntax, but it doesn't. It still works exactly the way it should. It lists out each of the elements in my person array. And the reason for that is because when Angular ties back this HTML text, this DOM, to the directive registries, it drops that character, the dash, the colon, and the underscore, and it turns it into the camel case version of that directive. It's called normalizing the directive name. And you can see that in action right here with my hello world items. I did it a whole bunch of times using it both as attributes and as element names, the underscore, the colon, the dash, whatever I need to do, and it works every time, just like that. But look at this. It ties back to a directive registry that's just camel-cased hello world. Don't worry about the rest of this just yet. When I registered that directive inside of my module, I registered it as hello with a little h, world with a capital W, and that ties back to all of these different versions of the directive. Now we also want to consider, why are we using directives at all? What's the point of these custom elements, jumping through hoops to create these custom attributes and elements, if we could do the same thing, say, with jQuery, where we don't have to create any custom elements at all. We simply write a command in our JavaScript to apply a date picker to an element. We can manipulate the DOM, manipulate the behavior right inside of our JavaScript with jQuery. Well, there's a couple of good reasons. For one, directives are very concise. They're very readable. And what we mean is, if you can imagine looking at an HTML document that someone else has written, if there's jQuery, if there's JavaScript in the background that's manipulating that DOM, it's not going to be obvious to you while you're looking at that HTML. When you're looking at that page, when you're looking trying to figure out how it works, you don't know what's being done to the DOM in the background with the JavaScript. Conversely, if you have a custom attribute or a custom element that says date picker, it's called date picker, then you're probably going to know that, hey, this is not just a plain old input box, but this is actually a date picker input box. And you'd be right, that's where the date picker is getting applied. Directives are also extensible. You can write your own directives, you can extend them and expand them as much as you want. You can even override the built-in Angular directives if you want. No one recommends that, but it's there. You can create your own custom library of functions for your application. And lastly, and most importantly, directives are testable. As we come to over and over in this video series, they create a good separation of concerns between your view and your controller, between your code and your presentation. That allows you to write custom directives that are testable, small, unit testable pieces of code that you can make sure they function properly, and then you can use them throughout your code wherever you need to. The question of what can directives do in AngularJS is probably easiest answered as just about anything. Take a look at this short list of only some of the directives that are built into AngularJS, a lot of which you've already worked with. You've got ng-app. That's used to bootstrap your application into memory, to load your application on the DOM. You can have multiple ng-apps on your page and load multiple different Angular applications with their own namespaces, their own scopes, their own root scope, inside of a single page. ng-controller, that binds a portion of your DOM back to the controller function in the backend. And remember, ng-controller is one of many directives that creates its own scope. You've got ng-bind and ng-model. Those bind your data back into your model that's found inside of your scope in your controller. Click, repeat, switch, all these things, they're used to control the presentation, the behavior of your DOM, so you can easily repeat sections of your DOM based on the data that's inside of your model. On top of that, there's a whole bunch of directives that you might not have realized were directives. Input, form, select, text area, a whole bunch of other ones. These are all HTML elements that have been overwritten with AngularJS directives. But they look no different than their HTML counterparts, and that's real important, that's real key. That's what makes AngularJS so great, is how easily it integrates with an existing HTML document and how legible it is for someone who already knows how to read and parse existing HTML. Documentation for all these directives and all the others can be found on the AngularJS website. I highly recommend you bookmark this documentation page, put it in your AngularJS bookmarks folder, and use it as a reference guide whenever you're working with any of these directives. We're almost ready to start creating our own custom directives. That's why we're here, right? But before we do that, we want to make sure that we understand how directives are interpreted by AngularJS, how they're applied to the page. So we're going to take a few minutes to go through the steps that AngularJS goes through so we can understand how to build our custom directive code in a way that makes sense. Now, the first thing that happens is that your HTML template is actually run through the browser's API. That's the first step, is that your browser gets to parse the HTML template, the HTML document. This is important to know. It sets Angular apart from a lot of other web development frameworks who do their parsing and produce HTML and then hand that HTML off to the browser. Because the browser gets it first, you need to make sure that your HTML templates are valid syntax. That's a lot of the reasoning behind the best practices for using dashes in your directive names and making sure that you really name them as attributes or elements as opposed to the other things. That ensures that the browser won't choke, it won't yell out an error when it's trying to browse this HTML template. It's going to look at that and say, okay, I don't exactly recognize that element, but it is valid syntax, so I'm going to pass it along. Once that's done and Angular gets a hold of it, the first thing Angular does is run something called the compile function. This is a built-in Angular function. You can tell from that little $sign out front. And what compile does is compile parses the entire DOM, actually traverses it, looking for directives. It starts at the element that the application is defined on by ng-app, and it starts going through the document and trying to match up the DOM to the directives that are registered in the back end of AngularJS. So this is where ng-model gets normalized into ng-camel-case model. This is where that matchup occurs between your DOM elements, your HTML templates, and your registration in the back-end JavaScript code of a directive. If those two names don't match according to these rules, including the capitalization in the JavaScript code, then you're not going to get this connection made during the compile step. Now, a given element in your DOM can have multiple directives associated with it, so directives can actually have a priority associated with them in their code that tell Angular which one should be evaluated first, second, third, etc. Angular sorts those directives in order of that priority so that they execute in the proper order, and then it calls each directive's compile function in order. And the compile function produces something called a link function. That's real important. We're going to talk a lot about that. So it's important to know that the compile function is executed, but the link function at this step is not executed. The link function is simply added onto a list of functions called the combined link. So first, this entire compile phase runs. Then the combined link function runs secondly, and the combined link function executes each of those link functions, and those link functions are where your watches are set up. Now the watches are what handle the connection between the DOM and the controller. They make sure that the DOM is updated whenever the model updates, and they also make sure that the model updates whenever the DOM changes. That's how you set up your two-way data binding in AngularJS. Now all of this may seem confusing, but we're going to see it in action here in just a moment when we create our own custom directives. Declaring custom directives in AngularJS can really be done in two different ways. There's two different mechanisms for registering your custom directive inside of AngularJS in your module. The first way, I'll call the basic way, is just to provide a link function. And all that does is skip this little compile step and hand off a link function directly to the combined linked list. Pretty simple and straightforward to do. That's what we're going to cover in this video, and a lot of times that's all you need to do in order to get a custom directive in your application. Now there's also a more advanced mechanism using a directive definition object, and the DDO offers a lot of different features and functions, some parameters and some properties that you can use in order to build a much more robust and much more powerful directive. And sometimes you may need to go ahead and use the directive definition object. We'll cover that in another video. But one of the features of the DDO is the compile function, which returns the link function like we talked about above. Let's go ahead and take a look at this in action. Here I've defined a very simple Angular application. ng-app equals my app, a sample controller, and I display scope.count on the screen. Now below that you can see I've got a button where I've indicated add-up as a directive on that button. That's my custom directive, add up. Down in my JavaScript you can see how I register that custom directive inside of the module. I call the module.directive function, myapp.directive, and that's just a function on the module object inside of Angular. That directive function very simply takes two parameters. The first is the name of my directive, in this case add up. And notice that's the normalized name, add-up. I've turned into add uppercase U up. Like I keep reiterating, you got to understand how the normalization rules work so that Angular can recognize this directive registration as relating to that add-up directive I have in my HTML template. The second parameter to the directive function is just another function, and all it does is return the linking function. That's what this guy is right here. The link function that gets executed after the compilation is done. So remember what happens when the application is bootstrapped, my app in this case is bootstrapped, it runs the compilation, and it runs through that entire compilation step and builds up a list of all these link functions, and then it executes the link functions. Check this out. Over here on my page, when I refresh this page, it pops up this alert, add up just got linked. And that's because I have that alert down here in my JavaScript in the linking function. So that got executed right when the page loaded. That was Angular bootstrapping, running through the compilation and executing the link functions. Now, what does this custom directive do? Well, very simply, I took one of the parameters that gets passed into the link function, lm, which is the element that this directive applies to, in my case the button, and I bound to the click event of it. We'll talk about how that works in a second. And I call a scope.apply scope.count++. So every time I click this button with the add up directive on it, it should increase my count by 1. Let's see if it works. Just come over here and add 1, and there it goes. This is a custom directive in its most basic, straightforward implementation. Let's take a closer look at how it worked. The linking function itself, I passed in 3 parameters. Now there's actually additional parameters that you can pass in, but they're optional. We only wanted to worry about these 3. The scope parameter, the first parameter, gets the scope that this directive exists inside of. In our case, that came from ng-controller. That created the scope that this directive is now running inside of. Now some directives do create their own scopes, ng-controller does. And if this directive, if we had programmed it to create its own scope, it would get a handle to that scope. But because we didn't, it's getting the parent scope passed right down into the function. That's how we can modify the count value on the scope. The second parameter that I called lm is a handle to the HTML element that this directive is applied to, in our case the button element. So that gives us a handle to the button element from the DOM, and it wraps it in something called JQLite, which is just a simplified, minified version of the jQuery library. Angular does this for us automatically. If we had included the jQuery, the full jQuery library, above our Angular include, up in our HTML, then this would come wrapped in the full jQuery library. But because it's just AngularJS, it gives us this jQLite, and that gives us access to some basic DOM manipulation functions in jQuery, like lm.bind. And that's what we use to bind to the click event. And inside of that click event for that button, all we do is increase the scope count by 1. Now also take note we had to wrap that inside of the scope.apply function, and we had to do that because this is happening outside of the normal update loop for JavaScript, so we had to tell Angular that we were getting ready to change one of the values in this scope. So there you have it, a brief introduction to directives in AngularJS. And we covered a lot in this video. We talked about what directives are, how they let you extend your HTML document to create really cool, readable, declaratively stated AngularJS templates. And we looked at all the different ways that directives can be used, including the different syntax that you can use in your HTML template so that it bounds appropriately to the JavaScript in the backend. We then talked about the implementation of directives directly in Angular itself. We looked at some of the built-in directives that Angular offers and all the ones that we've been working with, as well as a few that we haven't, as well as looking at how AngularJS goes through its compilation loop and links up those directives to the back-end JavaScript in your application. Lastly, we took a look at a simple custom directive. We broke it down, talked about how it worked, how the linking function worked, and demonstrated a simple, cool directive that we wrote in action. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this informative.